Greetings again, subscribers. Apologies for the delay in posting, I've been quite busy. I've had quite a few requests in comments asking for tips on piloting with flight assist off, and when will I be doing a guide, so I thought it's about time I did. There is, of course, it's known as flight assist off guide that I suggest you watch, but perhaps you have watched this already and are still having difficulty in getting your head and hands around it. This is not to say this guide isn't helpful, it is, but for reasons I will explain in this guide, there are certain tips and advice I believe I can point you towards and will hopefully help you with further quite critical information so as you can, or at the very least, are more likely to get to grips with it more easily. Tommy TTK has done a useful series recently describing flight assist off as well, showing you with helpful graphics the differences between the two modes. Perhaps what I'm about to show you here can be a supplement to both these guides, because I feel myself ultimately the main issue with learning to pilot with no assist is simply getting your head in the right zone, which in turn will hopefully get your hands and fingers to do what is needed. A quick note before we start. I had to add this after recording to explain after listening back to it. I expect you might have a little chuckle to yourself about this. Bizarre as this sounds, I might switch my accent throughout this guide on occasion. In my first live rated post last week, when I introduced myself, I said I'm from the north of the UK, which I am, but I moved up here when I was at a very young, impressionable age, so I have developed the northern accent as I've grown up. However, I may from time to time defer back to my southern accent at times in this. I believe I'd do it when emphasising something important, and go back to the southern accent then for some weird reason. And for when I'm reading something, as a great deal of this I wrote down first, to reduce the amount of ums and ahs. But anyway, enough of the weird introductions again, and as I said last time, let's get on with it. Just thought I'd point this out, if you get confused with my accent changing at times, it's what happens when you move up north with your parents as a wee snapper. So, this guide will hopefully help you get to grips with piloting an Elite Dangerous with no flight assists. However, before we get started, I should stress, I'm not suggesting you use flight assist off exclusively like I do. I never like to presume to speak for other people either, even if they have written their feelings in comments, but I expect even the maestro himself, Isonona, will agree. The only reason we fly like this with no flight assist all of the time is for the challenge and sheer enjoyment we get from it. It certainly is addictive once it clicks. This is not to say piloting with no flight assist doesn't have advantages compared to piloting with assists. In certain scenarios and situations it does, but ultimately those who toggle between the two modes and use both are the ones to be feared the most in combat. A further guide, the When to Toggle guide demonstrating these advantages, will come in the next upload once you have learned what I'm hopefully going to teach you in this guide, which will hopefully enable you to get the ship to go where you want it to go, instead of holding on for dear life in a piloting panic. And after watching this guide, and after a bit of practice, you'll be much better equipped for more advanced manoeuvres. Okay, I think we all understand spaceflight and Isaac Newtonian physics, so I'm not going to talk in great detail about this. It's not really necessary to understand in detail. As long as you have a basic understanding of spaceflight, this certainly helps, as you'll understand what is required and when, but it's not particularly crucial. A quick couple of sentences if you aren't sure how this relates to spaceflight in a space sim, and a few terms I will be using. When talking about ship momentum, I will use the word vector a lot. Vector basically means your headed direction, as indicated by the space dust. This space dust is Elite's vector HUD, heads-up display. The focal point of this space dust is showing you your current ship's vector, or current headed direction. I'll also refer to ship's orientation, which basically means the ship's attitude in relation to its vector. For instance, which way the ship is facing in relation to the direction of travel, again as indicated by the space dust, vector HUD. So vector and orientation, you'll be hearing these terms quite a bit. A couple of sentences about flight assist. With flight assist on, engaged, the ship's computer is using ship thrusters to keep your current vector, direction, true and steady. And if a pitch or yaw is initiated, i.e. you're asking the ship to change its vector, the ship flies in a steady arc turn depending on how much pitch or yaw you've applied. With flight assist on and engaged, if the pilot requests a steady pitch, up or down, or yaw, left or right, The ship's computer adds the relevant vertical or lateral thruster or thrusters, so the ship's vector turns in relation to the amount of pitch and or yaw you've applied. Otherwise all the pitch yaw would do would simply rotate the ship's orientation. So with this in mind, with flight assist off, the pilot has to input the relative thruster or thrusters combined with the pitch or yaw, so the same steady turn vector change can be achieved. As an example, with flight assist on, the computer adds these relevant thruster inputs or counters for you. For instance, heading straight on a headed direction or vector. With FA on, when you shut the throttle, you aren't just closing the throttle. You're actually telling the computer you want to slow down. So the computer adds the relevant thruster, namely reverse thrust, so your ship does slow down. With flight assist off, you have to input these counterforces yourself. Same applies for ship rotation or orientation. Any input of pitch, yaw or roll has to be countered with their opposites to stop this rotation. If you are currently a pilot who flies around with flight assist on and don't use ship thrusters, vertical or lateral, then yes, learning to pilot with flight assist off will feel like you are doing a great deal more work. But with greatest respect, you need to learn to use ship thrusters anyway. Whether you are piloting with assist off or on, you'll be a much better pilot using thrusters to strafe a target. Speaking of strafing, this is actually very relevant to assist off, because inherent in piloting the ship with no assists does have a tendency to strafe automatically, and most of our thruster control inputs are trying to keep this strafing under control, because the natural reaction is to turn to face towards your target, which in turn means you are not facing the same direction as your ship's vector anymore. By keeping an eye on the vector HUD, i.e. the space dust, you will be applying ship thrusters to keep this strafing under control. So, concerning controlling this ship momentum, overall I'm doing no more work really than you are with flight assist on, as long as you are a pilot that has already been using ship's vertical and lateral thrusters with FA on. So comparing these two modes together in workload, I'm simply doing things differently. Perhaps with more frequent inputs more of the time, but with smaller inputs nonetheless. And in the end I expect these workloads for this ship's momentum between the two modes aren't really that much different. They are just simply different ways of piloting. However, or but, the control for ship orientation, i.e. your joystick, then yes, the workload is increased, mainly because at first you will be overcompensating and making things harder for yourselves. Less is definitely more with ship orientation, aka rotation, with flight assist off. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I'll describe the reasons briefly because I'm pretty sure I stumbled upon a useful technique because of it. Because of a disability, I have to lean on the table with my elbow to stop me falling over. Again, more detailed description why on my discussion page. But this anchoring of my elbow will help massively for controlled inputs for ship orientation, similar to a painter pinstriping a car with his arm and hand anchored. So tip number 1, anchor your elbow when trying to aim with flight assist off. Okay, so let's get started, and you'll hopefully have a better chance of learning flight assist off if I can get you to execute certain techniques and to think in a certain way. What did it for me at first, more than anything else I believe, other than forcing yourself to take note of the direction of space dust pretty much most of the time, critical in piloting with flight assist off, but something else that helped me at first was actually not thinking I'm flying a ship, bizarre as that sounds. Perhaps this will work for you too, maybe it will, maybe it won't. But at first I thought of playing a first-person shooter and mapped my control method accordingly. I expect we've all played first-person shooters and can walk and run around with no issue. In space you are doing the same, but in a 6 degrees of freedom arena. If you have read my discussion page, you will have read I use an Xbox pad for ship thrusters, so momentum in our first-person shooter, 3-dimensional arena, I have mapped my control pad to simulate this. Forwards, backwards, strafe left, strafe right, strafe up, strafe down. Leaving strafe up and strafe down aside for the moment, this felt incredibly natural if you're used to playing first-person shooters, which I was, and the only added issue was learning to add thrusters for strafe up and strafe down, for a complete setup for ship momentum. which I've mapped to the gamepad's left joystick for forwards, backwards, strafe left, strafe right, and left bumper and left trigger for vertical thrust, strafe up, strafe down. I'm not suggesting you start using a ropey Xbox pad. I'm only using it because I couldn't manage the hands-on throttle on a consistent basis. But even using your hands-on throttle, if you think of playing a first-person shooter initially, perhaps this will help you make the inputs required more naturally, because this is what you would be doing if we were walking or running around space. Sounds ridiculous, but just go with me on this for now. Worked for me, perhaps it'll work for you. The best idea is to separate each hand in its own exercise, but before we do any flying we need to check our controls and mappings. Firstly, a quick demonstration of what control inputs you'll have to apply if you are using Elite's default mappings for ship thrust, which I expect you're probably using already if you haven't altered anything. And because of this are understandably having issues when switching to the flight assist off mode. I'll use the actual in-game ship's pilot and throttle to show you what I mean. Notice where trailing or idle throttle is on the throttle axis, right at the bottom down towards the pilot. So just shutting the throttle with this default setup will only just do that, shut the throttle. To apply reverse thrust to slow down, as you have to do when piloting with flight assist off, you have to press a button and add forward thrust, so very odd. So we'll change the control mapping in options to full range analog input. And now let's see where trailing throttle or idle zero throttle is positioned on the axis. As you can see, now trailing throttle is at center of the axis. So now to get the ship to slow down, you simply pull back on the stick like you used to with flight assist on to fire reverse thrusters. Having idle throttle at center will feel very strange at first, again simply because we've been playing the game with the default setup with zero throttle at bottom towards yourself. But once you practice and get used to remembering that trailing zero throttle is at center axis, you will find this setup so much more intuitive to use, and the ship will behave very similar to flying like it did with flight assist on. Main issue with this setup is simply because most hands-on throttles don't have a noticeable stop at center axis, so it'll be quite hard to find where zero throttle exactly is very quickly. So to help with this, we will add a noticeable dead zone. Not particularly a big one, as dead zones are best avoided even at the best of times, but a small one will enable you to find zero trailing throttle more quickly and make it more easily found. I can possibly preempt what some of you are going to say, perhaps in your comments. I can't land the ship anymore. And I agree, particularly because you have probably switched back to flight assist on when docking. This is the only time you will have difficulty with this setup. All other times and scenarios in combat, etc., this setup will feel much more natural to use, so I suggest you just stick with it. You will improve the more you use it, and remembering where zero trailing throttle is will become second nature eventually. Plus, it's not like we're under any pressure when landing your ship at a station, so just take your time until you get used to it. So, now we have the best mappings set, we can have a go at practicing flying around. Firstly, I suggest you practice just using ship momentum controls and leave ship orientation alone, i.e. your joystick. Then once you've got the feeling of flying around facing in one direction, which is actually quite easy if you think of your first person shooter days, with no ship rotation you will get to grips with what each thruster does very quickly. It's when you add rotation, i.e. your joystick, this is when it starts getting confusing very quickly, and before long you're out of control, so splitting this up in parts will help to learn much more quickly. Once you are comfortable how the ship behaves facing in one direction, is then to add small inputs of yaw at first, or pitch, but I suggest yaw so you can simply turn left or right and leave pitch for now. Again, because with our walking, running around space, we wouldn't be turning upside down and getting in a panic not knowing which way is up. Obviously there is no up in space, but again, just go with me on this. We are trying to split each control input as a separate lesson. So run around adding little yaw inputs and then counter each yaw with its opposite to stop the ship turning. Then try pitch and leave yaw alone. Practice adding little pitch and then countering this pitch with its opposite to stop the ship pitching, whilst all the while using the space dust to see the current vector of your ship. and using what you've learned with your left hand for ship momentum for thrusting forward, backwards, strafe up, strafe down, strafe left, strafe right. In this last segment, I will demonstrate turn rates with assist on and off to clear up any confusion comparing the differences between FA on and off. We'll cover more of this in more detail in the next upload, but I'll introduce this now to give you pause for thought. To start with, if a pilot flying with assist on were to have a turn rate contest with a pilot with assist off, and both were executing inputs to simulate the same ship behaviour, then the turn rates are exactly the same. Basically, the pilot flying with assist on, applying full pitch or yaw, has no way to increase his turn rate with or without thrusters, because the ship computer always adds them for you. Adding any further thruster inputs mid-turn will actually slow this turn even more. In a similar vein, but for different reasons, the pilot flying with assist off, to simulate the exact same turn as the FA on pilot, will have to input the relevant thruster to the pitch or yaw, but we'll stick with pitch as an example for now so as not to confuse things. But the same principle applies for both. Also, yaw is the slowest axis on all ships, so you'll be using pitch as preference anyway. So, for the FA off pilot, to make a turn at the same speed as the FA on pilot, he has to input vertical thrust with the pitch. Otherwise, all the pitch would do would simply orientate the ship. Or another way of saying that, rotate the ship's orientation to the point he will be travelling backwards, and his vector, direction, remains unchanged. This can be a useful advantage. You have turned quicker because you have added no thruster, whereas the FA on pilot has had no choice because his ship's computer has added it automatically. But as much as the FA off pilot has turned his ship around quicker and is now facing the FA on pilot, he is subsequently now travelling backwards. The disadvantage now for the FA off pilot is he has been increasing the distance all this while from his target, the FA on pilot. So the FA off pilot will have to either apply forward thrust to close the gap again, which will in essence stall his craft because he has to get to zero forward momentum first before he can actually start travelling forwards again. Or the only other option is to add vertical or lateral thrusters to start a strafe to the FA on pilot, who is still finishing his turn. So starting a strafe will enable you to use the velocity your ship still has in a positive offensive tactic, perhaps even with boost, because travelling backwards and then boosting is a great way to vary one's boost cycle so as not to overshoot your target. However, this is not your only option. This is where it can get quite interesting. If the FA off pilot were to add small increments of vertical thruster with his pitch so as to change his vector, so he's not just travelling backwards with an unchanged vector, and incidentally these smaller increments of thruster are less than the amount the computer has added to the FA on pilot's ship, one can still make a tighter turn than the FA on pilot. The FA off pilot's velocity will be reduced and less than the FA on pilot's, but the difference will not be an excessive amount to recover from as to cause a stall. So despite after making this tighter turn your velocity being slightly less than the FA on pilot's, you will be able to get back up to attack and evasion speed much more quickly, compared to if you were just travelling backwards at full speed with a vector unchanged. So are still able to target the FA on pilot sooner because you have turned quicker and aren't a sitting duck in a stall. We will cover this in more detail in the upcoming toggle guide, but ultimately the thing you need to remember is pitch speed accumulates the longer you hold it with FA off. If you add little increments of vertical thrust during this pitch, a choice the FA on pilot hasn't got, because his computer always adds the same amount of vertical thrust to go with his full pitch, you will have still turned quicker than the FA on pilot and not induced a stall, as opposed to trying to recover from travelling backwards, aka a vector unchanged. So when executing these smaller thruster inputs, we can actually change our vector quicker than the FA on pilot, not just orientate quicker. But like I've said, you will have a reduced velocity compared to the FA on pilot, but not a reduced amount too great to recover from or become a sitting duck for too long. I hope this last segment makes sense. I thought I'd give you a sneak preview of some of the more advanced techniques that can be achieved, but these will be covered in much more detail in our upcoming toggle guide. The best pilots are the ones who toggle between the two modes, flight assist on and off, at the right times, and can continue the ship's behaviour seamlessly when switching between them. So next upload will be a guide when to toggle flight assist and tips on how to continue the ship's behaviour as seamlessly as possible. So in the meantime, get used to piloting with flight assist off in all conditions first by practicing what we've covered in this guide, and then we'll adapt what we've learned in the next upload with toggling flight assist on and off to become a competent fighter in combat. As usual, please subscribe, comment, thumbs up, thumbs down. Feel free to ask me any further advice or to clarify anything I've said. Thanks for watching and good luck.